To understand the world, do not rush to explain it. Learn first how to watch. It sounds simple, almost gentle. And yet hidden inside this idea is a quiet rebellion against certainty itself. What if the deepest truths are not found by conquering knowledge, but by waiting with it? What if brilliance is not loud, not decisive, not finished, but slow, unfinished, and endlessly curious? Tonight's story lives inside that question. A life shaped not by answers, but by attention. He is remembered as a genius, a painter with an unforgettable smile, a mind said to be centuries ahead of its time. And yet he was also a man who rarely finished what he began, a man who distrusted conclusions, who seemed forever suspended between beginning and becoming. He was an artist who dissected bodies by candlelight, an engineer who dreamed of flight while watching birds from quiet hillsides, a thinker who filled thousands of pages with sketches, observations, and questions, and then left most of them open. He was admired, protected by kings, and at the same time misunderstood, outpaced, and often quietly alone. This is the paradox of Leonardo da Vinci. A man whose light came not from certainty, but from wonder, whose shadow was not failure, but incompletion. A figure standing at the threshold between art and science, faith and observation, the visible world and the invisible forces beneath it. His story begins in central Italy in the year 1452. In a rural corner of Tuscany, beyond courts and cathedrals, a child was born with no title, no inheritance, and no promise beyond the land itself. Nothing about that moment suggested greatness. Only quiet, only time. His life does not move like a triumphal march. It drifts, it circles, it pauses. And that is why it belongs here in the quiet hours. So now, friend, let your shoulders soften. Let the room fade slightly at the edges. You do not need to remember dates or names. You do not need to stay alert. This story is not here to test you. It is here to carry you slowly through a human life lived in deep listening. If along the way you drift towards sleep, that is perfectly fine. If a question lingers after the night ends, even better. And if you wish to return for another story, or suggest a life you'd like us to explore next, you are always welcome to leave a quiet trace, a comment, a thought, a subscription. For now, nothing more is asked of you. Breathe. Listen. This is the Bedtime Biography of Leonardo da Vinci. Chapter 1. Vinci, the early years of Leonardo's life. A mother places a hand still carrying the scent of cheese on her son's forehead. The child has burned with fever through the night, sweat soaking the rough linen beneath him. Outside, the smell of damp earth and early morning mist drifts through the open window, mingling with cold ash and the faint trace of roasted chestnut shells left from the evening before. On the wall, a dried olive branch hangs from a wooden peg. Somewhere in the distance, a wild rooster calls again and again. That moment, brief and suspended between two lives, may have been the earliest and warmest memory Leonardo ever kept of his mother. Caterina gave birth to him in silence, and she left him just as quietly a few years later. A peasant woman, perhaps once a baker or a household servant, she belonged to a class without voice or standing. After Leonardo's birth, she married a local potter and began a family of her own. Leonardo was born on April 15, 1452, beneath the thin morning haze of Tuscany. He was the illegitimate son of Ser Piero da Vinci, a successful notary in Florence. Their bond was never made official. When Leonardo was about 5 years old, he was taken to live in the home of his paternal grandparents in the village of Vinci. From that point on, his mother remained only as a trace of scent in memory, like a single strand of hair left behind on an old pillow. Vinci, a small rural pocket of Tuscany, was not a place known for producing great names. It was a land of wine-fractured limestone and streams that ran dry in summer. In the 15th century, a world where bloodline defined one's rights, a child born outside marriage lived at the margins. No inheritance, no legitimate name, no clear road ahead. Yet it was this very condition that offered something rare: distance, unbound by the rigid expectations of classical schooling. Leonardo was free to look quietly, and the world revealed itself in ways no one had taught him. He lived with his grandparents and his uncle Francesco, a farmer who loved the land and its living things. There were no books, no Latin lessons, no algebra. But Leonardo possessed another gift: his eyes. Not eyes admired for beauty, but eyes that never released what moved. They followed the flight of bees, distinguished subtle shades of green on individual leaves, and could linger for hours, watching water fall from a tiled roof into a patch of mud spreading outward in rings that slowly dissolved. Neighbors later recalled that Leonardo once followed a lizard for an entire morning simply to learn where it fled when afraid. On another occasion, he heated beeswax and poured it into an ant nest, only to watch how the ants responded. No one taught him to do such things. No one understood why he did them, but he did because the world never stopped calling. The first world Leonardo truly knew was not a classroom or a church. It was the forest. There stood poplar trees rising as bell tower streams that reflected the sky like polished mirrors, and the layered scents of pine resin, rotting leaves, and forgotten animal hides. Nature was not merely a place to play. It was a place to test. Every pine cone became a model of mechanics. Every bird's nest is an act of architecture. Every crack in the earth is a quiet whisper from the bones of the land. In his earliest years, Leonardo did not draw. He had no paper, no pen. Instead, he built forms from twigs stacked stones into strange arrangements. When adults cut meat, he watched the fibers separate. When they struck stone, he observed how force traveled through matter. He did not know he was learning yet. This learning ran deeper than any formal curriculum. His family by blood at least offered Leonardo a measure of safety. Though born outside marriage, he lived among relatives and did not go hungry. But the wider world never stopped reminding him of rank and position. The son of a notary could not easily enter the great religious orders. A child without a legitimate surname would always be expected to prove himself. Florence, several days' journey away, was already glowing with art philosophy and political intrigue. But in Vinci, Leonardo knew the world through scent. The smell of freshly cut grain, the smell of his mother's hair after a day in the sun, the sharp tang of tar from the blacksmith's fire. These things, seemingly trivial, would return years later in his paintings, in his designs, even in the way he described the movement of wind. Once, as the young Leonardo sat drawing on the ground with a stick, sketching a cat stalking a mouse, a passer-by stopped to watch. After a moment, the man asked why he did not draw something grander. The boy replied simply that this one was alive. In the world of Leonardo's youth, there was no idea of genius. But from the beginning, he carried a rare instinct. He understood that by looking closely at something small, one could glimpse an entire universe. Chapter 2. Born outside marriage, a life at the edge of society. In the village of Vinci, people rarely spoke Leonardo's name directly. They called him the Da Vinci boy, their tone carrying a mix of regard and distance. Everyone knew he was the son of Ser Piero, but not in a way that could be written down. There had been no wedding, no entry into a family record. In a place where lineage was valued as dearly as land, Leonardo's position was a quiet fold in the social fabric. He was raised acknowledged, yet never made official. In 15th century Tuscany, status was an invisible form of wealth. A child born to a lawful marriage was entered into baptismal books, given a proper surname, entitled to inherit land books, and sometimes even an office. Children like Leonardo, born outside marriage, were kept beyond that boundary, never fully recognized, no matter who their father was. Ser Piero Leonardo's father was a gifted notary with wide connections in Florence. He married after Leonardo was born, and his new wife was not the boy's mother. Over the course of his life, Ser Piero would have 12 legitimate children. None would rival Leonardo in talent. And yet, only Leonardo would be denied inheritance. Still, Ser Piero provided him with a basic education. Drawing, simple calculations, occasionally a private tutor. But there was no Latin, no Greek, no monastic schooling. The classical disciplines of philosophy, logic, and theology were closed to him. In the eyes of Florentine society, he could never become an uomo universale in the traditional sense. He was an outsider. That position, suspended and unattached to any clear class, was an oddity in Florence. The city was ruled by the Medici, a family that loved art and mastered influence with equal skill. Here, artists survived through patron certificates of training the right accent and the right doors. Everyone played a role. Leonardo had none, and perhaps because he had no role, he watched others as if they were all performing. Leonardo never learned Latin as a child. This marked him, in the eyes of scholastic scholars, as uneducated. Instead of arguing back, he let his work and his observations speak for him. In his notebooks, he would later underline a single idea: saper vedere, to know how to see. For him, knowledge did not live on the page. It hid in the movement of water, in the anatomy of the human body, in light striking a plastered wall. That note carried the imprint of a bookless childhood where understanding arrived through action, through the bent back of a laborer, through the hinge of an old door. He lived in a material world without the concept of ownership. He knew how to fold paper into spinning wings, how to stack stones into small towers that did not collapse, how to redirect water using banana leaves and a few pebbles. No one called this science, yet it was the groundwork for every technical thought that followed. Once Leonardo sat for hours inside a blacksmith's shop watching a man sharpen a blade. The next day, he recreated the motion of that man's arm in clay, so precisely that the smith exclaimed that the boy had eyes like a saw blade cutting all the way down to the grain of the wood. And so he grew. Not in the sense of moving up through lessons, but by rising through observation one moment at a time. He learned how to fold paper into spinning wings, how to stack stones into small towers that would not fall, how to redirect water with banana leaves and a handful of pebbles. No one called this science, yet it was the groundwork of every technical way of thinking that would come later. He also learned how to hear what people said behind his back, and how not to answer. One night, Leonardo passed by the old church in the village. In the darkness, there were voices speaking softly, just loud enough to reach him. Words about bloodlines, about status. He stood behind a rotting wooden gate, his hand gripping a cloth pouch filled with charcoal sticks. He said nothing. But the next morning he drew a mouth, pressed shut. No teeth, no tongue. Yet the eyes were wide open as if staring straight through flesh itself. No one paid attention. But years later, when people looked back at Ginevra de' Benci or the curve of the Mona Lisa's lips, they would begin to understand. Silence, too, has an echo. That position at the edge kept Leonardo from entering the academies of his time. Yet it also spared him from being trapped by scholastic philosophy. While thinkers argued over the nature of the soul, he dissected bodies to see where the human heart truly lay. While aestheticians defined ideal beauty, he sketched distorted faces at the edge of the market. While others lectured about angels, he recorded the movements of bats and owls. The margin is sometimes the place from which the center becomes clearest. Perhaps for this reason, Leonardo never felt fully at home anywhere. Not in Florence, not in Milan, not even in Rome. In his notebooks, he rarely referred to himself by name. No I, no Leonardo. Only eyes, hands, forms, motion. In a society where names, rank, and bloodline meant everything, Leonardo walked with the name Da Vinci trailing behind him. Not a family name, but a place. Not Leonardo belonging to someone, but Leonardo coming from somewhere. When a name does not point to a father, does not carry a crest or a promise, it offers no shelter either. Leonardo learned to live that way, expecting no welcome, and still continuing forward. Chapter 3. The Workshop of Verrocchio, where Leonardo learned to see matter. No one knows the exact day Leonardo first entered the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, but it was likely a misty morning when Florence was still half asleep and the scent of damp wood from slanted rooftops lingered in narrow alleys. Outside, the Arno flowed quietly, as if careful not to disturb the city as it woke. The wooden door leading into the workshop was heavy and worn, always releasing a dull thud when someone stepped through. Inside lay another world. Not the world of churches or classrooms, but a world of matter, of hands, of patience. The smell of oil paint mingled with tanned leather beeswax and freshly forged metal, still warm from the fire. Every corner carried its own sound. Brushes sweeping across wood, hammers striking bronze molds, charcoal crackles inside the furnace. Verrocchio's workshop was not merely a place to learn drawing. It was a complete school of the physical world. Here one learned from the core, how to mix pigments from minerals, how to grind glass, how to cook rabbit skin glue to stretch a canvas. Each task was a lesson in material structure, reaction, and time. Materials were everywhere: wood, cloth, clay, mineral pigments, charcoal, copper wire, beeswax, linseed oil, eggs, and animal hides. There was no lectern, only scarred wooden tables and half-carved statues with no eyes, yet no fingers. Each sculpture was a body in the process of becoming, and each artisan a participant in its gestation. Leonardo, the young man from Vinci, was at first a quiet presence. He spoke little, never showed off. Yet within weeks, others in the workshop noticed something. He observed more than anyone else. While other apprentices copied models, Leonardo quietly tested his own approaches. He was not allowed to draw right away. During his first year, he was given only auxiliary tasks: grinding pigments, cleaning brushes, stretching canvas. Instead of growing restless, he performed them with uncommon attention, as though learning the first rites of a devotion centered on hands and eyes. The workshop of Verrocchio shaped Leonardo's material thinking. Here art was not only about beauty, it was weight, tension, balance, texture. To draw a single strand of hair, one first had to understand how it clung to the scalp. To carve a human body, one had to know how muscle and bone supported each other as gravity shifted. This was where Leonardo learned that to see was never enough. One had to feel how the world held itself together. Andrea del Verrocchio, the master of the workshop, was an artist of engineering precision. He did not limit himself to painting. He designed armor-cast statues and crafted decorations for festivals. His work stood where power gathered: churches, palaces, public squares. Yet he was not a mystical figure. Verrocchio demanded accuracy down to the millimeter. He was the kind of man who would adjust the edge of a suit of armor for 3 full days because it did not yet carry the right sense of force. Leonardo learned from him not only with his ears, but with his eyes and his hands. In later notebooks, when Leonardo wrote about the movement of water or the way joints create stable structures, those ideas could be traced back to days in the workshop. Days when he held a small file to smooth the edge of a copper plate, watching its form shift beneath the slanted light of afternoon. When Verrocchio painted a Madonna, Leonardo did not simply copy the pose. He studied the model's fingers as if trying to understand their mechanics. Once Verrocchio allowed him to paint an angel in the background of a composition. When the painting was finished, Leonardo's angel shone with such presence that, according to legend, when Verrocchio saw it, he set down his brush and never painted again. The story may be apocryphal, but it carries a deeper truth. Leonardo learned through sight. Not an ordinary sight, but a vision that penetrated structure. To him, every object was a system. A dress was not merely cloth, but a series of moving waves. A neck did not simply support the head. It was a lever for emotion. He saw not only outlines, but the tension of fabric, the breath beneath skin, the gaze that lingered at the edge of an unspoken question. This kind of visual thinking, not imitation of form, but a search for underlying force, was not something Verrocchio taught. It was something he may never have fully understood. In Florence at the time, artistic workshops formed the foundation of all visual culture. They were not merely places to make paintings. They produced church gates, monuments, musical instruments, and courtly decorations. An artist was expected to master many crafts: painting, sculpture, mechanical design, even the staging of festivals. It was within this multi-layered, interconnected environment that Leonardo first grasped a powerful idea: that all forms of knowledge could speak to one another. Verrocchio himself, an artist grounded in technique, did not restrain curiosity. He allowed Leonardo to dismantle tools, examine locking mechanisms, and experiment with new materials. On one occasion, Leonardo mixed pigments using an unusual compound, creating a layer of paint that dried quickly and adhered with unexpected strength. The space of the workshop formed a closed universe of its own. Mornings began with the sound of an older apprentice lighting the furnace. At midday, slanted light poured through the tall windows, turning drifting dust into something like suspended incense smoke. By evening, the scents of leather bronze and sweat settled into every plank of wood. Leonardo loved that smell, the smell of work, the smell of matter freshly transformed. At this time, Florence stood at the heart of the Italian Renaissance. The Medici patronized the arts to reinforce political power. Paintings were not merely meant to be hung. They served as instruments of diplomacy, symbols of faith, weapons of image and influence. Andrea del Verrocchio received commissions from churches, nobles, and craft guilds alike. And Leonardo, moving within that current, learned that art was not made by emotion alone. It was built through structure, logic, and systems. The years in Verrocchio's workshop were when Leonardo learned to see matter in its fullness. He began to understand that light does not merely illuminate. It presses, bends, and carves across surfaces. He noticed the difference between the sinews of an old man's hand and the skin of an infant's neck. He realized that the weight of an arm lies not in muscle alone, but in how it bears force. At Verrocchio's side, Leonardo did not simply learn a craft. He learned how to translate the world into objects. A drawing was no longer an illustration, but a set of relations. A shadow was not just darkness, but the way an object spoke about the direction of light. And a work of art was not a single image, but the outcome of hundreds of small decisions. Which pigment to use, which wood to choose, what proportion would hold. It was here that he began keeping notebooks. Pages dense and untidy, yet sharp. Sketches mingled with remarks, observations with experiments. From this point on, he stepped onto a path few in his time dared to walk, that of being both painter and engineer. Verrocchio did not teach him how to become a genius, but his workshop was where Leonardo first understood that to grasp the world feeling was not enough. One had to touch, measure, dismantle, and assemble. In a society that treated art as a skilled trade, Leonardo quietly built something else for himself. A system of observation, an intuitive map that would guide him from matter toward essence. Chapter 4. Leonardo da Vinci's early unfinished works. Florence in the late 1470s was a city of color and artistic breadth. Red brick walls caught the glow of late afternoon. Public squares carried the scent of pine resin. Church bells rang as if every passing moment were bound to a sacred purpose. Yet for Leonardo da Vinci, this period became a time defined not by completion, but by what remained unfinished. Not long after leaving Verrocchio's workshop, Leonardo began receiving his first independent commissions. His patrons were small churches, monasteries, and occasionally local nobles. To them he appeared as a young talent, careful, meticulous, full of promise. What they did not realize was that the man they hired did not see himself as only a painter. From the beginning, Leonardo refused to accept that role as sufficient. The Adoration of the Magi, his first major commission around 1480, stands as a clear example. Ordered by the monastery of San Donato at Scopito, the painting was intended as a grand celebration. The three Magi presenting gifts to the infant Jesus, set within a majestic and crowded scene. Leonardo approached the work with intensity and astonishing detail. Every figure carried its own motion. Every face held a distinct state of mind. Even the architecture in the background unfolded like a labyrinth of space and light. But the painting was never completed. The figures were left without flesh tones. Columns stood unfinished. Hands reached outward without ever grasping what they sought. After a few months, Leonardo abandoned the work. Not long afterward, he left Florence. Why he did so puzzled his contemporaries. Modern observers can only speculate. For Leonardo, when an idea moved faster than technique, the hand became an obstacle. Perhaps he did not stop for lack of time, but because he could not accept the distance between what he saw in his mind and what his hand could bring into being. Florence was a city that produced masterpieces, but it also demanded strict obedience to time and results. An unfinished work was seen as a failure. An artist who missed deadlines risked losing reputation. Leonardo, inclined toward inquiry rather than closure, did not seem troubled by this. He did not paint in order to deliver. He painted in order to understand. There were moments when he spent an entire week studying the angle of a wrist, then altered an entire composition because the gaze between two figures failed to connect emotionally. No one forced him. Yet no one could stop him from dismantling his own designs. During this period, Leonardo left behind a wealth of sketches: heads, hands, horses, bridges, stone arches. Few completed paintings. Many assumed he was scattered, undisciplined. But a closer look reveals a continuous thread running through those drawings. He was learning to see the world as a system of motion, not as a fixed frame. Florence may not have had room for this kind of artist. The city needed images. Leonardo demanded principles. Patrons wanted paintings to hang on walls. He needed to understand how the spine twists. And when he did not yet understand, he would not continue to paint, even if it meant losing commissions, even if it earned him a reputation for unreliability. The years from 1476 to 1481 thus became a strange interval. Quiet on the surface, explosive beneath. Leonardo never stopped drawing, but now, mostly for himself. He studied anatomy without official permission. He examined the movement of horses, the structure of bridges, and the fall of stone, not to complete paintings, but to prepare for something no one had yet commissioned: a new visual language. He left behind countless unfinished sketches and fragmented notes, leading later scholars to realize that Leonardo rarely settled into final conclusions. In his manuscripts, mirrored handwriting and marginal marks reveal a mind constantly posing new questions, as if conversing upstream with itself. Each line struck through marks a pause for doubt. This habit meant that his works were almost never finished in the conventional sense. Others completed paintings to be paid for. Leonardo left them open in order to keep thinking. For him, an idea not fully understood should not be framed. And as long as there was more to observe, there was no need to end. Art history holds thousands of unfinished works. Yet Leonardo's incomplete sketches became priceless, not because they lack something, but because they remain open. Every unresolved line is a door left ajar. Every hand without defined fingers is a question still breathing. This is where his value lies, not in what was finished, but in what remained in motion. Unfinished does not mean failure. For Leonardo da Vinci, incompletion was not a flaw. It was evidence of a mind moving faster than its time. Florence may not have understood this, but Milan just might. And it was precisely at this moment, when drawings still lay scattered and unresolved, that Leonardo began to think of leaving. To seek a city where intelligence was not confined within frames, but allowed to ask a larger question. What else might still be seen? Chapter 5. The case of 1476 and Leonardo's withdrawal from Florence. April 1476. In Florence, Leonardo da Vinci, 24 years old, was named among those accused of unnatural acts alongside 3 other young men. The charge originated from an anonymous denunciation slipped into a public letterbox known as the tamburo, set into the corner of the Palazzo della Signoria. At the time, the punishment for such an offense could be death, or at the very least, lifelong disgrace. Florence was entering spring, yet the warmth had not fully arrived. A lingering chill clung to the air. On balconies, baskets of orchids had not yet bloomed. Roman statues stood dusted from nearby construction. The atmosphere was damp, and the city itself seemed to be listening. To bells, to whispers, as though art and prejudice were locked in a quiet struggle. There was no concrete evidence, no witnesses stepped forward. Within weeks, the case was dismissed for lack of proof. But Florence, in all its brilliance and cruelty, did not forget. In the official records, Leonardo's name remained, paired with language vague yet unmistakable. The case, though closed in law, opened an invisible fracture in his life. Leonardo never wrote a single line about this episode in his notebooks. Yet in the years that followed, his withdrawal from Florentine social life was unmistakable. He appeared less often in public squares, rarely attended gatherings of artists. He no longer submitted works to guild competitions, nor sought major commissions from churches. It was as if the accusation, though never proven, had shut one door and opened another vantage point. Leonardo began to look at Florence from the outside. The city that had once felt like the heart of the Renaissance now seemed constricted. Art was regulated by councils, by the church, by contracts, and by approvals. Everything had to be made legitimate, images and people alike. And Leonardo, already an outsider by birth, found himself pushed even farther from the center. Some said he grew cold. Others described him as withdrawn and unreadable. Yet, in his notebooks, the drawings continued without pause. The anatomy of horses, the structure of bridges, human musculature, even designs for weapons. If Florence did not need him as a painter, he would become an engineer. If the church would not accept him, he would work with nature. If society demanded a proper face, he would return to shadow and light, where form is born of movement, not judgment. During this same period, Leonardo began moving between Florence and the surrounding towns. Pistoia, Prato, sometimes farther still. He was not seeking seclusion, but a rhythm of life that did not depend on the gaze of others. In his manuscripts, notes on hydraulics mills and flowing water appeared with growing frequency. Perhaps it was then that he realized he did not need a judging council in order to do science. He needed only to observe. One drawing from that year survives. A hawk bound its wings half spread. No caption, no explanation. Yet placed within this moment, the image feels like a quiet metaphor. A talent restrained by prejudice, but not broken. Leonardo did not protest publicly. He did not defend himself. Instead, he recorded everything, as though preparing for another time, one in which silence itself would be reread as an act. Many later scholars would suggest that the case of 1476 drove Leonardo away from Florence a few years later. But the decision was not an escape. It was a natural transition, a movement away from a place where art was confined by frames toward one where knowledge could be applied more freely. That case did more than interrupt the early arc of his career. It reinforced a trait that would remain with him for life: discretion. He never married, left no detailed will, founded no household. Yet he left behind thousands of pages of notebooks, as if everything he wished to say was already there, needing no further voice. As Florence returned to the lively pulse of an artistic capital, Leonardo, now a name spoken more in whispers than in praise, began to look elsewhere. Toward Milan, a city more industrial, more complex and less demanding of appearances. A place that needed people who could design systems, not only paint images. And there the man once judged unfinished could become a true originator. Florence, for all its light, cast a long shadow across Leonardo's life. Yet it was within that shadow that he began to see more clearly the untouched spaces of brightness beyond. And sometimes being pushed away from the center is the only way to glimpse the whole. Chapter 6. Why Leonardo left Florence for Milan. By the late 1480s, Florence still shimmered like a painted scene. Red rooftops. The Arno is catching the last light of day. Stone colonnades cast long shadows across public squares. Yet to Leonardo, the city had begun to feel like a carved wall, a place where artistic curves were trimmed by the scissors of convention, where the new was required to ask permission from the old before it could appear, and where those who differed were often pushed to the edge. Florence was the heart of the Renaissance. But even the strongest heart beats to a rhythm not everyone can hear. Here art was made legitimate by councils, by the church, by customs hardened into law. A painting had to be beautiful in the right way. It had to inspire in the approved manner. It had to be accepted before it could be displayed. An artist was expected to meet deadlines, to defer to established forms. Slowly, Leonardo came to sense that intelligence extended beyond rules. He would stand before walls crowded with celebrated works by revered masters and notice something in the gaze of the crowd. An invisible judgment. Not all of it was wrong, but all of it belonged to the same system of evaluation. Leonardo was different. He did not stop at form. He searched for a mechanism. He did not wish to repeat inherited models. He wanted to ask the questions again. It was during this time that an invitation arrived from Milan, a northern city unlike Florence. Milan was a land of dukes where power and strategy intertwined, where art was not only decoration, but also engineering machinery, festival design, and even the planning of fortifications and military devices. Ludovico Sforza, the ruler of Milan, had a reputation for favoring new ideas. He understood that an artist was not merely someone who painted well, but someone who could think broadly and act across disciplines: architecture, mechanics, urban planning, machines. Milan did not only need paintings for the walls, it needed minds capable of designing, observing, and anticipating. A letter reached Leonardo da Vinci inviting him to Milan to test his abilities on a larger stage. Painting, monumental sculpture, contributions to technical projects. For many, it would have been simply a professional opportunity. For Leonardo, It felt like a door opening toward a farther horizon. Even while still in Florence, Leonardo had never stopped studying. Hydraulics, motion, human anatomy. Yet these interests were not valued by the society around him. While others waited for finished images, Leonardo searched for what made a line move in the first place. The nature of force, not merely its appearance, Florence demanded answers in the form of images. Milan seemed willing to ask a different question. And it was toward that question that Leonardo began to turn. It was not an act of rebellion, nor a loud protest. For Leonardo, leaving was the result of an inward motion that had been gathering for years. It was the way he stood quietly within his own shadow, observing life from outside the circle of the center. Earlier, the case of 1476, though it ended without conviction, had planted something deep within him. A slow retreat from the race for public acceptance. In his notebooks, he never wrote a single line about leaving Florence. Yet the sketches grew denser. Lines began to move with greater purpose. Structures became more stable. Marginal notes multiplied about force, about the interaction between objects and light. He did not draw in order to deliver. He drew in order to understand. And once he understood, he wanted the place where he lived to reflect that way of seeing. Florence was a city where art was coated in beauty, yet bound by it. Milan was a place where art was treated as part of an operating system. In Florence, people wanted beautiful images. In Milan, they needed solutions. And Leonardo, who worked not only with a brush, but with technical thought, began to see clearly where his role truly belonged. He was not searching for fame. He was searching for a thinking environment. A wider space, more varied tasks, and most importantly, fewer rigid assumptions about how an artist was supposed to work. It is said that before leaving, Leonardo sat quietly, beneath the shadow of a column outside his home, watching the light fade as if listening to the city's pulse one final time. There were no laments. No farewells. When he stepped away from Florence, he carried a heavy cloth bag, not filled with money, but with rolled notebooks, dense with questions and unfinished visions. In the narrow corners of the city, sketches he never had time to color still clung to the scent of charcoal and wax. But to Leonardo, this was not failure. It was the road toward Milan. Florence, radiant and brilliant, remained behind him. A field of blinding light, yet lacking the depth he required. Milan lay ahead. A place where art and engineering converged. Where unfinished questions could lead to new answers. And when Leonardo crossed its threshold, his step was not an escape. It was an advance into a place where thought itself was allowed to open wider. Chapter 7. Leonardo da Vinci in Milan, a man of many roles. In the early 1480s, Milan still bore the scars of power struggles between rival dynasties. Moss-darkened city walls, man-made canals cutting through commercial quarters, and buildings that were half military, half artistic, formed a landscape both imposing and pragmatic. Unlike sunlit Florence, Milan was often wrapped in fog, carrying the metallic scent of forged iron from its armories. This was a city of strategy and construction of power, bound to usefulness, a place where people trusted organization more than inspiration. Under the rule of Ludovico Sforza, Milan was in the midst of transformation. Competition among the Italian city-states had taught Sforza that image and technology could serve as instruments of subtle domination. He did not merely build palaces or stage festivals. He invested in military research infrastructure and new forms of visual persuasion. For a mind like Leonardo's, this was not simply employment. It was an open social laboratory. Soon after arriving, Leonardo da Vinci presented Sforza, the most powerful duke in the region, with a letter outlining 10 points. It was not a conventional application, but a catalogue of abilities. Designing bridges, constructing weapons, building fortifications, developing hydraulic systems, organizing festivals, erecting monuments. Only at the very end did he mention painting. For Leonardo, painting was one part of his craft, but never the whole of it. Ludovico recognized this difference. He did not see only a painter, but an organizing intelligence. And so, Leonardo was entrusted with a wide range of tasks. Portraits, court spectacles, symbolic architectural projects. Each assignment was a challenge, and each became a door through which his thinking could expand. During his years in Milan, Leonardo held no single fixed role. He was at once engineer, architect, stage designer, anatomist, and still a painter. Yet there were no clear boundaries between these identities. When he designed a machine to lift heavy materials, he was also drawing. When he studied the flow of water, he was learning how light bends. When he staged a court performance using mechanical systems to create artificial rain, he was practicing art through engineering. It was Milan, with its practical demands and ducal resources, that allowed Leonardo to turn observation into application. He studied fortifications, tested dam models, and mapped terrain with the naked eye. And in every task, he left the mark of someone unwilling to accept inherited solutions. Here, intelligence was not asked to decorate walls. It was asked to work. His workshop stood near the Navigli canals, where water from the Ticino flowed through an underground system that Leonardo himself would later help improve. Inside the space was both chaotic and ordered. Gear models rested beside anatomical drawings. Copper tubes for experiments lay next to boxes of pigment. A long wooden table was always covered with parchment sheets, chalk mineral powders, and angle measuring tools. The window opened toward the west, where afternoon light slanted across unfinished sketches. In his Milanese workshop, Leonardo da Vinci began to systematize his thinking. He drew not merely to describe, but to explain mechanism. From the wing of a bird, he moved toward the structure of flight. From the form of human muscle, he reasoned through push and pull, leverage and balance. Each drawing became part of a larger mechanical order where art and engineering were no longer separate languages. During this period, he began gathering students. Not pupils who learned only how to draw, but observers trained to see. He taught them to study objects from multiple angles to render movement rather than a static pose. Milan became the first environment where Leonardo did not merely create, but planted the seeds of a way of thinking. And he did not work alone. On major projects, he collaborated with engineers, architects, blacksmiths, and stage artisans. He learned to speak in different registers, technical language with engineers, visual language with painters, symbolic language with those in power. This ability to translate thought across disciplines made him a rare connector between worlds that otherwise remained apart. One project followed him for years. The Sforza horse, a monumental equestrian statue intended to be the largest in Europe. Leonardo studied the movement of horses, casting methods, and lifting systems. But war intervened. Bronze was diverted to weapons, and the statue was never cast. Still, the research he conducted laid the foundations for applied mechanics in sculpture for generations to come. Leonardo's success in Milan was not measured by the number of completed works. It lay in the number of questions he posed and the systems he built to pursue them. He did not draw forms alone. He drew their capacity for motion. He did not draw people alone. He drew the mechanisms that give rise to expression. He did not draw wings alone. He drew the desire to fly. In Florence, Leonardo had once been seen as an artist who did not finish. In Milan, he became an initiator. And that transformation was possible only because the environment did not act as an audience, but as a counterpart in dialogue. Milan did not make Leonardo a genius, but it was the first place that allowed him to be fully himself. A man unwilling to remain still within the boundaries of a single title. An artist, an engineer, a designer, an observer, and above all, an intelligence in constant motion. Chapter 8. The Last Supper. When Leonardo finished an answer, both Florence and Milan know the feeling of afternoons stretching as the sun sinks lower. Yet nowhere held Leonardo da Vinci in stillness quite like Santa Maria delle Grazie, a modest convent wrapped in the echo of bells threading through narrow alleys and stone walls darkened by time. It was the year 1495, and here he was given a task that would quiet the entire world of painting. To paint the supper, the Last Supper, not a smooth white wall, but a surface larger than any he had faced before, nearly 16 feet wide and more than 10 feet high. The limestone wall had once held a side altar along the convent corridor. Now it stood empty, waiting to receive the final moment in which Christ shared a meal with his 12 disciples. On the first morning, Leonardo faced the wall. Light streamed in from the eastern windows, laying pale bands across the stone. The silence was so complete you could hear dust settling onto the tiled floor. And there, he did not see a wall. He saw a stage, not only the shapes of figures, not only the light, but the before and after. Motion held within stillness. During his early years in Milan, Leonardo had grown accustomed to technical projects, strategic maps and designs more complex than ordinary painterly gestures. But the Last Supper compelled him to return to the source of seeing itself. Not only what had already happened, but what was about to happen. In faces, in glances, in fingers, in the breath that had not yet left the mouth. He stood before the wall for hours without painting. Instead, he absorbed the air of the convent. He listened to the footsteps of monks passing along the stone corridor. He noticed how the old wooden door whispered when it opened. He followed the movement of sunlight across the hours the way light reflected off dulled ceramic statues. He did not prepare with small sketches. He prepared with his eyes and ears, with the breathing rhythm of the space itself. When he finally set brush to wall, the marks were not quick outlines. They were questions stretching the length of the surface. Is this the moment when Jesus says, "Truly I tell you"? How does the gaze beside him respond? At what instant must the hand touching the cup pause, so that both the story and the feeling are told at once? Leonardo chose the instant just after Jesus says that one among them will betray him. Not the moment of public declaration, not a moment of calm, but the moment when emotion surges to its highest point and no one has yet found words. That is why no figure in the painting stands still. Hands lift, shoulders jolt, eyes widen. Every garment, every fold of cloth, every trace of light on the wall becomes a register of psychology, not merely of form. In a nearby room lined with parchment monks and project overseers would sometimes pause to watch and whisper among themselves. Some could not understand why Christ was placed amid such turbulence. Others felt Leonardo was reaching too far. But in the long nights he spent facing the wall, Leonardo held only one dialogue, between light and motion. The air inside Santa Maria delle Grazie carried the feeling of a northern Italian spring afternoon, a hint of lingering cold, the first arrival of warmth. Wind slipped between stone columns, bringing the scent of damp earth and incense smoke. Candlelight reflected off the long wooden table, casting muted glimmers across the limestone. This was not a mere setting. It was the fourth material Leonardo painted with. He did not use traditional fresco where pigment is applied onto wet plaster. Instead, he experimented with his own method, binding pigments with a mixed medium to extend working time and deepen tonal softness. At first, the surface glowed, fresh, luminous, true to the way light behaves in nature. But this same technique would later make the painting fragile, prone to fading. And that vulnerability would become part of the tragedy entwined with his legacy. Day after day, Leonardo da Vinci stood before the wall painting, then stepping back several paces to watch how light shifted with the hours. He placed a row of wine cups, a loaf of bread not yet broken, a wrist extended as if passion had just passed through it. He was not painting a static image. He was painting a moment in motion where time has paused and continues on the same breath. The apostles are not figures frozen in silence. They touch one another through glances charged with suspicion, doubt, trust, and hesitation. Judas sits to the right, clutching the money bag, his body drawn backward as if by instinctive self-defense. Jesus rests his hands before his chest as though he has just spoken a prophecy and is now hearing it echo within himself. One afternoon, as slanted sunlight passed through the window and fell precisely upon Jesus' place at the table, Leonardo da Vinci stood motionless, listening to a rhythm deeper than sound. He was not painting beauty. He was painting reality, force, motion, reflex, and what the ordinary eye so often fails to notice. Once a monk asked him why Christ seemed not to look at anyone. Leonardo did not answer with words. He gently turned his brush and added a trace of shadow beneath Jesus' eyelids, as if light had slipped through leaves in the convent garden. Jesus' gaze is not empty. It is inward, a place where questions gather unanswered. When the supper was finished in the way Leonardo believed it had to be, it was not simply a narrative painting. It was a silent question stretched across the wall, a symphony of light and posture, where every mark held a breath of anticipation. He had not merely shaped human bodies. He had shaped human response the instant people faced the most devastating declaration of their lives. The Last Supper is not only one of Leonardo's rare completed works. It is a convergence of everything he had observed for years: light, motion, human nature, and the way these forces collide in a fragile instant that has just happened yet has not fully passed. Perhaps that is why, from the very beginning, this painting was never merely a mural inside a convent. It was a challenge to face the truth of a moment rather than search for still beauty. And it is that challenge that makes The Last Supper a masterpiece. Not because it hangs in a sacred space, but because it reveals a deeper way of seeing the world, one in which every figure is caught within a moment entirely their own. Chapter 9. The Sforza Horse, an unfulfilled ambition. A sketched horseshoe lies adrift on a page of a leather-bound notebook. A gentle arc, yet within it lives force-weight endurance. Leonardo did not draw the horseshoe for beauty. He drew it to ask a question. If all weight is compressed into a single point, what then is balance? That question began to pull him toward a dream cast in bronze, a monument that would never be poured. This was no ordinary horse. It was to be a monument of power. A colossal bronze standard rising at the heart of a public square, as sacred as an unprecedented declaration of victory. It came to be known as the Sforza horse, created in honor of Francesco Sforza, the founder of the ruling family. Morning light cut across the walls of the Visconti castle, reflecting off the damp earth of the training grounds. Foundations were mapped across long sheets of parchment. The curves of the horse's back and neck were traced with care. Each day, Leonardo da Vinci arrived, carrying brushes, chalk, and rolls of notebooks, slowly becoming a private library. He did not merely draw form. He embedded motion into every curve. No equestrian statue of such scale had ever been cast in Europe. And for that very reason, Leonardo could not rely on inherited rules. He spent hours observing living horses in their stalls, watching how muscles tightened when they leapt, when they stood, when they turned their heads. He drew in charcoal chalk and lead. Every detail of the horse's body was not an appearance, but a system of forces. Here, too, he experimented with techniques few had imagined. clay models many times larger than life. Internal wooden frameworks were used to test how the weight would distribute, bracing structures to prevent the massive clay form from collapsing. Each morning, craftsmen around him, men accustomed to carving stone by pattern, watched him as an outsider. And yet, they learned slowly how to look more deeply at what they thought they already knew. Leonardo did not hide his ambition. He knew that if he could cast an equestrian statue beyond all previous scale commanding the square, allowing people to see force and motion frozen in bronze, it would stand as a silent proclamation of human capacity, of humanity confronting nature and mastering it. But reality, as always, had its own voice. In the first years of sketching, everything moved according to Leonardo's design. Ludovico Sforza supported him not only with words, but with bronze, land, and materials. Leonardo's earlier achievements, court festivals with mechanical staging bridge designs, and city maps had all reinforced confidence in his abilities. But when it came to the horse, the work everyone believed would soon become a masterpiece, the current shifted in another direction. Politics. Italy at the time was far from calm. Kings, dynasties, and alliances moved like intersecting whirlpools. France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire each watched this divided land with intent. When a greater force pressed toward Milan, everything artistic or symbolic became secondary. Bronze meant for casting was diverted to weapons. Leonardo's powerful sketches of a colossal horse were suddenly reduced to models that could never be realized. One winter afternoon, as a cold wind swept across slabs of clay still damp, Leonardo da Vinci stood before his model. The horse's form was complete in detail, legs firm, body strong, mane lifted as if by wind. But the clay was cold and wet, the wooden joints creaked softly. He understood then that without bronze all of it would remain only memory. He did not recoil. He did not cry out. He stood before the work as one stands before a problem without a solution. How to integrate force, balance, material, and time into a structure the world had never seen. Milan still needed him, but Milan was being pulled by the storm of war and power. When French forces entered the city, the horse, still clay, still drawings, was left among storage rooms. Bronze was for cannons now, not for monuments. The world saw only that the work was unfinished. But for Leonardo, unfinished did not mean ended. It was merely a pause in a long inquiry into motion. When materials vanish, when an era no longer makes room for art, an idea must wait. And in that suspended moment, Leonardo returned to the core of his pursuit. He was not working for beauty. He was seeking to reveal the nature of force, of reaction, of balance, and of imbalance as well. After the project was halted, Leonardo began to write more intensely. And across those long, unbroken pages of notebooks, we see that he no longer treated art as a wall separating itself from engineering. For him, sculpture became an inquiry into force, an analysis of structure, and an observation of light and gravity at the same time. Notes on gears, joints, and levers. Originally devised for machines, now threaded their way into animal studies, into the way he described the relationship between shoulder and torso heel and pedal. The Sforza horse, though never cast in bronze, had become a lesson in force and motion. Years later, when Milan fell and the horse was forgotten, the drawings remained. Scattered across Europe, passed from hand to hand, they reached later generations. They never saw the finished monument, but they saw the outlines of an open system of knowledge, one in which art and engineering no longer stood in opposition. Leonardo achieved something he never formally announced. He taught his readers how to see force rather than shape. Once standing before the clay model, a student asked him why he drew every tendon in such detail. After all, the bronze would not be cast any time soon. Leonardo turned a brief smile crossing his face in the dim afternoon light. He pointed to a newly drawn curve and said that if one understood how that line carried force, one would know how to cast the whole world. He said no more. He did not need to. The Sforza horse and ambition left unrealized was not merely a temporary failure. It marked a shift in Leonardo's axis of vision, away from physical form toward the principles hidden beneath form. There he no longer saw an uncast statue, but a system not yet fully explained. The horse stands silent on paper, in clay, in notebooks. It challenges those who come after not simply to finish it, but to understand the motion it seeks to express. And it is these unanswered questions that shape the enduring legacy of Leonardo da Vinci. Chapter 10. The Fall of Milan. When knowledge is cut short by its age. The drums that once marked the coming of dawn faded along the streets of Milan. But the echo of French soldiers' boots never truly fell silent. This was not the sound of celebration, nor of merchant carts at work. It was the sound of unyielding power. Leather shoes soaked with mud from the night's rain moved past unfinished structures, past quiet furnaces and abandoned workshops, striking against walls where Leonardo da Vinci had once laid down careful lines of thought. There was no ceremonial announcement, no public square filled with proclamations. The French army entered as if Milan were nothing more than a fold on a map opening and closing, without pause. Ludovico Sforza, the Duke who had once commanded every resource that nourished creative intelligence in the city, was now little more than a shadow within his former palace. Leonardo was not arrested. He was not executed nor accused of treason. Instead, he found himself standing behind an old doorway, watching morning light slip through a window frame and understanding that the environment itself had shifted. Like water diverted when it meets a wall, his life suddenly changed course. Only months earlier, Milan had been a place where drawings, models, and projects, including the Sforza horse, were regarded as a forming legacy. But once the drums had passed, all such solemn pursuits became secondary. Sketches of force and motion notebooks dense with inquiry no longer held attention when cannons and territorial strategy commanded every thought. Leonardo left Milan on a morning of light rain, accompanied by a few close students and a thin bundle of notebooks. It was not an escape. It was a deliberate withdrawal. He did not want war to force him to choose between one side or the other. Nor did he wish to lock his intellectual faith to a power that could vanish overnight. His inner life, like the flowing water he had so often studied, required its own channel in which to move forward. They passed through Mantua, then Venice. Each stop, even if it lasted only an afternoon, made Leonardo pause. He watched the water at the docks, felt how light rested on stone, tracked the way broken tree shadows fell across ancient walls. In Venice, he drew a detailed map of a small canal, even though his patron had asked for nothing more than a simple illustration. For him, drawing was never an act of copying form. And then came Florence, the old city where he had begun, where he had once stood at the margins because of his birth and because of how he saw. It was still there, radiant as before. But this time when Leonardo da Vinci returned, he was no longer the same man. He was not seeking a role within the artistic councils. He arrived instead as a traveler, carrying a weight of notebooks filled with unanswered questions. Florence greeted him with midday light, a light he had always known, yet one that now carried deeper layers. Light falling across the hands of a painter once known for leaving major works unfinished. Light settling onto the folds of notebooks dense with observations of bridge design joints, flowing water, and models no one had yet translated into physical form. During this period back in Florence, Leonardo did not re-enter public artistic life. Rather than appearing at auctions or ceremonial unveilings, he moved quietly behind the scenes of the city. He walked between workshops, spoke with carpenters, blacksmiths, and surveyors. He asked questions that briefly unsettled those he addressed because they were not the concerns of an ordinary painter. How does water change depth when a current shifts direction? How do gears bear force within crude mechanisms? How does light reshape the human form when it cuts across a dark workshop at an angle? These questions served no title. They were not paintings for wealthy patrons. They were not sketches for paid commissions. They were simply thoughts about motion within matter. An idea he had been pursuing since the days of the Sforza horse. In Florence, there were those who doubted him. They asked why he did not spend his time finishing a few works to secure recognition. Leonardo shook his head. His life was not aimed at recognition in the usual sense. He had already seen a way of seeing interrupted by history in Milan. He understood that a finished painting does not reveal truth. What matters more is how the eye learns to see it. One afternoon, as he walked along the old walls of Florence, light stretched long across the crown of the arches. He stopped and pressed his finger into a patch where mortar had fallen away. The stone still held warmth, but the crack was where shadow slipped in. Leonardo gazed into that fissure as he did into the unresolved spaces of his own designs. He did not draw the shadow itself. He drew the place where shadow meets light. Returning to Milan was never part of the plan. Yet news of the old city and the unfinished statue followed him through villages and along stone roads. And somewhere between Mantua and Florence, a larger question began to take shape in his mind. When knowledge is no longer welcomed by its age, must it not seek a new source on its own? after the disappointments in Milan and the quiet return to Florence. Leonardo understood that the questions he carried needed a different ground for testing. Urban life no longer offered enough space for structural thinking. He needed a place where observation could turn directly into application. And war, dangerous as it was, opened that door. And just as his notebooks were always open, each page became a layer that concealed or revealed another question. Not finishing did not mean failure. It meant only that the path continued to widen ahead. Chapter 11. Leonardo da Vinci and War. Intelligence in the service of power. A map is never just an image. It is a dialogue between eye, foot, and mind, where every number and every measured angle carries a question. For Leonardo da Vinci, a map did more than describe space. It asked about power strategy and the ways humans impose control over territory as they do over ideas. In one of his small notebooks, vertical lines and gentle curves recall city walls, artillery bastions, canal cuts, and the winding of roads. This was not a map of an ordinary city. It was a vision of strategy. He did not draw from an imagined height. He measured from the ground, placing every footstep, every angle, every incline into precise position. For Leonardo, measuring was a means of understanding. To draw was to think strategically. Perhaps for this reason, when he left Florence, after his mixed experiences with art and engineering, Leonardo did not seek a quiet retreat. He moved instead toward new challenges, where power war and mapping became a proving ground for intelligence. And it was there that he encountered Cesare Borgia. In 1502, news reached Florence of a young and fiercely ambitious duke. Leonardo knew he was about to enter another role. No longer a painter of walls or a designer of bridges alone. He would now become a mobile military engineer, where creative invention and strategic calculation were equally necessary. As in every Italian court of the time, the peninsula was split by rival calculations of power. The church royal houses and city-states all pressed against one another. Cesare, son of Alexander VI, sought to carve out his own dominion in the Romagna. His determination to control fortresses and strategic routes went beyond traditional modes of rule. In Il Principe, Niccolò Machiavelli would later describe Cesare as a cold strategist, one who redefined how a territory could be dominated through the disciplined use of power. Leonardo came to Borgia not with a sword, but with a compass, a distance-measuring wheel, and precise maps. He traveled with the retinue, passing ancient fortifications and crossing open fields under the heavy summer sun. The city of Imola became his first major stop. Recently conquered by Borgia, it required immediate reinforcement of its defenses. There, Leonardo produced a map using advanced surveying methods. Angles, distances, roads, and artillery positions were rendered to scale with a precision unseen in earlier cartography. To look at that map is to catch a glimpse of a primitive satellite view. A direct vertical perspective that made defensive structures and routes legible at once, as if seen through the eye of intelligence itself. This map was not merely a sheet crowded with lines. It was a strategic instrument. Where military plans demanded precise knowledge of artillery placement weaknesses in city walls or supply routes, this map provided exactly that. In the hands of Cesare Borgia, Leonardo's map became a critical piece in a game of power, allowing the young duke to gain advantage over rival factions and to organize forces along the most decisive corridors. Yet the work did not end with measuring cities. Leonardo da Vinci followed Cesare across central Italy, through forests along the banks of the Suio River, to fortresses in Cesena, and into territories beyond the reach of many engineers of his time. He observed how water curved around riverbanks and translated those motions into broken lines on paper. He studied how fortifications anchored themselves into the ground. He surveyed the roads along which armies would move, not simply to draw them, but to identify points where defenses could be breached, or cavalry might gain decisive advantage. One afternoon, with a sharp wind blowing in from the Santerno and the earth still damp with mist, Leonardo stood before the entrance of an old fortress. Beneath the trees, moss-covered stone walls curved like a frozen wave. He set an angle measuring tool against the slope of the wall, calculating how force from artillery fire would travel and where collapse might begin. He sketched a diagram, its lines bending like script, then turned to glance at the low sky drifting with clouds as if searching for a strategic opening, invisible to most eyes. Some contemporaries mocked him, a painter wandering among fortifications, asking questions about the angle of a wall or the direction of a river's bend. Yet it was precisely these questions that enabled him to produce maps of unprecedented accuracy, forcing those in command to see him differently. Cesare wanted more than maps. He wanted someone who could merge the art of observation with strategic understanding, and that was why Leonardo was chosen for the role of chief engineer. He granted him the freedom to survey and access every fortress and town that came under his control. It was a rare position for an artist. The position of an intellect entrusted with power, tasked with turning observation into strategy. But war was not only about maps and fortifications. It was shaped by abrupt decisions, by death, intertwined with strategy and political gain. In 1502, even toward the year's end, violence marked the broader historical picture. One of Cesare's own commanders was executed by the Duke's order, a moment that revealed a mode of rule both ruthless and cold. Leonardo witnessed part of that darker face of power. He did not take part directly in rituals of violence, yet he understood that an ambitious strategy required more than accurate maps. It demanded iron resolve and a willingness to accept unnamed cruelties. By late 1502 and early 1503, as Cesare Borgia began to lose his advantage following his father's death and the advance of rival forces, Leonardo da Vinci withdrew from service and returned to Florence. In that brief span of time, he left behind a body of maps and notes, not only of Imola, but also documents that would later help others understand terrain fortifications and the deeper truth that strategy is not merely the movement of armies. It is the construction of knowledge within a world shaped by conflict. The roads he surveyed and the maps he drew became valuable records for later generations, not only for their precision, but also for the questions they posed. How can geometry, measurement, and art work together to reveal strategic reality? In the surviving notebooks, sketches of defensive lines, notes on how the sun strikes a wall at dawn, and detailed renderings of Imola remain. They stand as evidence of a period when intelligence was placed at the center of power's vortex. That experience deepened Leonardo's hunger for understanding, closing one chapter, while opening others for journeys yet to come. He returned to Florence not to rest, but to begin another task. A painting of a historic battle. There, amid public expectation and political pressure, Leonardo would enter a phase of misalignment, where the rhythm of his inquiry collided with society's demand for clear, immediate results. This return was not a retreat. It was a transition. From strategy in the field to strategy in representation. From maps that served conquest to images that would shape collective memory. And once again, he would face the enduring question: can depth overcome speed? Chapter 12. Return to Florence, out of sync with society. After years of moving through war maps, fortresses, and power, Leonardo da Vinci returned to Florence. He chose to re-enter the sphere of official artistic life. Florence, once the cradle of Italian painting, had also once regarded him as a source of pride. But this return unfolded very differently from what he had imagined. Early 16th century Florence was no longer a city guided solely by artistic ideals. It demanded direct symbols, clear images of politics and victory. Here art was treated as an instrument of public message rather than as a private terrain for deep personal inquiry. Not long after his return, Leonardo received a major commission, a monumental mural commemorating Florence's victory over Milan, the Battle of Anghiari. It was to be placed at the very center of civic power inside Palazzo Vecchio. It was the kind of project any celebrated painter would dream of. For Leonardo, it became another test altogether. How does one paint motion on a flat surface? How does one convey the thunder of hooves, the force of violence, the strain of human will in the midst of battle using layers of pigment? He began with genuine intensity, yet from the earliest sketches, the difference was clear. Leonardo did not paint to finish quickly. He painted to investigate. He studied how force presses into flesh, how sinews tighten under strain, how hands wrestle with reins amid shouts and clouds of dust. And once again, he moved slowly. He experimented with a new painting technique rarely used in pursuit of greater depth and detail than traditional fresco could offer. He examined how light fell obliquely across multiple surfaces. But the method failed. Pigment spread unevenly. The surface cracked. A brilliant conception became impossible to complete as originally intended. During this period, Leonardo faced more than walls and paint. He faced mixed reactions from patrons and the public alike. Some whispered that he was too slow. Others wondered whether he was truly focused. Many simply saw him as an aging master, struggling with a commission that demanded clear symbols and swift results. Once again, Leonardo found himself out of step. Not because he lacked vision, but because his way of seeing moved at a depth that society, in its urgency, was no longer prepared to wait for. This approach stood in stark contrast to what Florence expected. The city wanted a painting that was complete, radiant, unmistakable. Leonardo wanted to peel back each layer, still thinking like a researcher, unable to draw without asking where a force originated and how it acted. That misalignment was inevitable. Not because he lacked skill, but because he no longer moved at the same rhythm as society's expectations. In an age turning toward propaganda and the control of images, Leonardo appeared increasingly out of place. Yet it was precisely within this dissonance that his thinking deepened. Although the Battle of Anghiari was never completed, its surviving sketches featuring rearing horses, straining riders, and faces twisted in conflict are still considered among the most vivid portrayals of motion and emotion ever conceived. Like light and water, violence is a form of energy in motion. And Leonardo, rather than glorifying victory, chose to record the nature of conflict itself, the moment when human beings confront one another with both body and instinct. During the same period he worked on Anghiari, he was also painting the Mona Lisa, a subject that would accompany him for the rest of his life. Every stroke on her face, every translucent layer of paint, every inward gaze became part of an internal conversation he held with himself, not with patrons, not with artistic councils. The gap between what society demanded and what Leonardo sought grew ever clearer. He moved constantly, taking notes on how light rests on hilltops, on psychological shifts within a face, on how pressure travels through layers of pigment. He was no longer a painter in the conventional sense. He had become an observer of the world working through art. Here we begin to see a different Leonardo, quieter, more restrained, yet driven by a deeper desire to see what lies beneath the visible. It was also at this moment that he turned inward, withdrawing from public expectation. Titles mattered less. Understanding mattered more. He came to realize that to grasp the essence of form, he first had to grasp the nature of vision itself and of the human body. This marked the beginning of his profound anatomical phase, when his subject was no longer painting, but humanity itself. Chapter 13. Anatomy. Leonardo sees the human being as a mechanism. A bone was never merely a hard object. To Leonardo da Vinci, it was a pathway through which light and force traveled inside the body. He saw bone as architecture, a structure in which weight and motion are organized and held in balance. Through countless sketches of skulls, wrist joints, shoulder muscles, and torsos, Leonardo gradually formed a vision of the human body as a machine more complex than any mechanism he had ever designed. In the early years of the 16th century, after a restless period, moving between Florence, Milan, and the service of Cesare Borgia, Leonardo turned his focus toward a subject many painters avoided: human anatomy as it truly is. He was not content to imitate outward appearance as most artists of his time did. He wanted to uncover what lay beneath the skin, the structure of muscle and bone, the pathways of nerves and blood, the hidden logic that made the body move. No one knows the exact moment Leonardo first took a blade to understand the human body. His notebooks suggest that he began with a skull, then moved gradually to muscles and joints, as if dismantling a finely made device to discover why it functioned as it did. At first, he relied on his drawing skills to record what he could see: the jawbone, the vertebrae, bundles of muscle wrapping around the shoulder joint. Before long, he understood that surface observation was not enough. He began dissecting human cadavers, sometimes in hospital mortuaries, sometimes in cooperation with contemporary scholars of anatomy. Over time, he examined many bodies, each one revealing more about the biological purpose of its parts. More than 300 pages of manuscripts survive from this work. They describe muscle layers, the interlocking structures of tendon and bone, rendered with such clarity that these drawings are now considered anatomical illustrations far ahead of their time. One page showing the femur and knee joint in charcoal and ink is so precise that it can still unsettle modern viewers, closely aligning with knowledge developed centuries later. Leonardo did not limit himself to describing shape. He recorded the function. He asked whether force would travel differently if a joint rotated another way, which muscle pulled, which tendon to initiate motion. He viewed the body as a coordinated mechanism where every part influenced the whole. In studying anatomy, Leonardo was no longer merely drawing people. He was learning how life itself holds together. In one well-known sketch, Leonardo da Vinci drew the entire skeletal and muscular system of the hand, each finger rendered from multiple angles. Every line reads like a slope of force. Every layer of muscle resembles a set of strings, drawn taut by the intention to move. These details were not created solely for art. They were genuine scientific records meant to grasp the true nature of motion. During this period, he carried out dissections on more than 10 human bodies to verify what he observed in drawings, comparing them with animal anatomies he had previously studied, such as cattle, horses, and birds. With each dissection, he wrote extraordinarily meticulous notes. From the structure of the skull to the bundles of chest muscles, from cross-sections of the hip joint to the branching forms of veins. One of his early insights was that bones are not static objects. They shape how the body bears weight and create axes for movement. He drew the femur, then attached muscle groups to it, then described how tendons contract and pull, all as parts of a complete mechanical system. Each joint became a lever. Each muscle bundle is a pulling cord. The entire body is an intricately balanced architecture. Leonardo also focused on small details with large consequences: the proportion of forearm length to lower leg, the placement of ligaments, the way the spine curves to absorb load. He began recording these principles not only through drawings, but through explanatory notes, written observations placed beside the illustrations as if he were quietly lecturing an attentive reader. But anatomy was never only mechanics. As he moved closer to the nervous system and the networks of blood vessels, Leonardo sought to understand why sensation and movement arise from deep within. He drew the brain, studied the folds of the skull, and traced the branching of nerves. This was a remarkably early approach for his time, when such territory was barely explored. It was here, perhaps, that he began to sense that the human body was not merely a machine, but a point of intersection between matter and perception, between motion and feeling. It is no coincidence that the Vitruvian Man emerged during this period. Leonardo was attempting to unite beautiful proportion with functional structure. Proportion for him was not decoration. It was a principle of operation. Leonardo never published his anatomical studies during his lifetime. They remain scattered across thousands of manuscript pages passed on to his pupil, Francesco Melzi, after his death, and only centuries later, rediscovered and fully appreciated by later generations. Yet even while he lived, this deep analysis of the body shaped everything he created. It influenced how he drew figures, how he understood movement and force, and how he came to see the human being as a complex system in constant operation. In the final days of this long phase of research, Leonardo recorded flowing observations about the heart, the internal organs, and the layers of tendons that bind them to bone. It was as though he were composing a treatise on the human body, not in prose, but in images. This concentration lasted nearly a decade, from around 1500 to roughly 1510, and left behind an anatomical archive unlike anything the world had seen before. Leonardo did not always find answers in the human body. At times, a tendon or a nerve branch seemed to lead nowhere conclusive. Yet it was precisely in this uncertainty that he began to suspect something larger. That behind visible motion lay broader laws, laws carried not only by flesh and bone, but also by light and by water. Chapter 14. Light, Water, and the Laws that Govern the World. Light was never merely something that illuminates. For Leonardo da Vinci, light was a quiet storyteller. It did more than reveal form. It exposed structure, expressed motion, and made visible forces the naked eye could not yet grasp. Water, too, was never just a substance. It was the trace of time and force in motion. In light and in water, Leonardo discovered laws broader than any artistic description, laws of nature itself. In the years after leaving his role as military engineer under Borgia and before traveling to France, Leonardo spent long stretches in Milan and Florence. He did not focus only on people or machines. He watched phenomena that never stopped moving. Morning light cutting across a door frame, water slipping from roof tiles into narrow gutters, tree shadows trembling in the wind. Each was a play of force, time, and space. In one notebook, he wrote a question like a blade drawn across the page. If one knows how to see light, one will know how to grasp motion. It was not a casual thought. It was a declaration. Light for him was an instrument for understanding the world. Across manuscripts that grew ever thicker, Leonardo analyzed light in layers. Direct light, reflected light, absorbed light, scattered light. He treated shadow not as a mere imitation of darkness, but as a dialogue between what exists and what cannot be seen. A shadow is not simply a dark area. It was the place where the force of light meets a surface, and in doing so reveals the structure of the object itself. The way Leonardo drew shadow was not an act of copying nature, but of dissecting it. He drew a sphere under slanted light, not because of how it appeared, but because it taught him that light and darkness are two expressions of the same movement. He wrote that shadow is the language of light. And he did not merely listen. He translated that language into form. Before long, water became the center of his attention. Water flows not only along natural curves, but according to an inner logic. It slows in deep channels. It spirals when it meets resistance. It spreads in widening circles when a raindrop strikes still water. Leonardo spent hours watching it. A river to him was not just a river. It was a recording of force and time. Once seated beside a long canal, he watched small waves strike a stone embankment. He drew the expanding rings not as simple shapes, but as expressions of force. Where the curve was strongest, where it weakened, where the wave rebounded, and why. He filled pages analyzing how water reacts to obstacles in the same way he studied how force travels through bone when the body moves. Water for Leonardo was never static. It was a constant demonstration of the laws that govern all motion. In light and in water, he began to see a single thread, the same principles that shape the body, the same forces that bend trees and carve valleys. And through patient observation, he came closer to a vision of the world, not as a collection of objects, but as a continuous system in motion. Between light and water, Leonardo discovered a shared principle. Continuous motion always in the act of fading. Light moves from second to second, shifting angle by angle, turning darkness into brightness and back again. Water never stands still. It reflects light, alters its shape, and obeys gravity and motion without pause. Leonardo refused to separate art from science. To him, they were the same narrative told in different registers. When he drew water flowing over stone, he was not merely drawing form. He was trying to grasp how water speaks about motion. When he studied light reflected on a curved mirror, he did not see simple black or white. He saw the point where force meets shape. In one well-known manuscript page, he sketched concentric ripples spreading outward from a single drop falling onto still water. Each circle was not just a shape. It was an expression of force traveling across a surface. He annotated the drawing with a thought. Water reflects what the eye cannot see, but the intellect can sense. He devoted many studies to swirling currents. In city drains and in wide rivers alike, he watched how vortices formed, how rotational force repeated itself, how each ring of water wrapped around a center. He called this the language of motion, and it was this language he sought to translate into a system that could explain nature more deeply. With light, he traced straight rays passing through layers of air, then cast shadows onto white walls to analyze how beams refracted. He had no modern instruments. His eyes and mind became his most precise tools, registering every degree of brightness and shade, every layer of reflection, every blended tone. Students later recalled that he could stand by a window for hours, not in awe of the scene outside, but absorbed by how light oscillated from moment to moment. Morning light was soft and smooth, midday light sharp and clear, evening light flickering and gentle. He never drew anything without first asking 3 questions. Where does the light come from? How does it change in space? And what does it reveal about the structure of the object? He also saw light and water as the rhythm of the world. When light strikes the surface of water, it creates countless undulating patterns, not at random, but through the interaction of force, angle, and reflection. Water shaped by light does more than mirror the world. It retells the forces moving beneath the surface. Leonardo carried this inquiry directly into his art. When he painted portraits, he did not merely describe a human face. He painted the light that softens sharp angles, the glimmer of moisture in an eye, the way shadow flows gently across skin. In landscape sketches, the curves of rivers and the folds of water beneath the evening light were treated as statements of motion, not scenery. In the final manuscript pages of this period, he seemed to arrive at a unifying idea. Everything that happens follows a rule, whether it is light striking a wall or water slipping through a crack in stone. This rule was not a rigid law, but a web of relationships among small movements where each part influences the whole. There he wrote one of his most delicate conclusions. To understand light and water is to understand how the world works. No proclamation, no lengthy argument, just a quiet sentence resting among pages dense with analyses of rippling circles, light rays, shadow, and reflection. Leonardo da Vinci did not stop there. But in this phase, he laid the foundation for a way of seeing the world that scientists and artists would continue to develop long after him. Light and water, seemingly simple elements, became the keys through which he unlocked deeper doors into nature, motion, and life itself. Chapter 15. Leonardo da Vinci in Rome. When the world no longer waited. When Leonardo da Vinci arrived in Rome in the early 1510s, he stepped into a city that was at once magnificent and absorbed in itself. Rome was not only the spiritual center of Christianity, it was an artistic superpower, a dense convergence of ideas, images, and authority, layered like the vaults of basilicas, filled with light from stained glass. In the broad square at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, a military procession had just ended amid gunpowder smoke and applause. Church towers rose into a clear blue sky, catching the morning light. At the same time, artists like Raphael were creating frescoes that proclaimed papal power, while Michelangelo continued his monumental work at the Sistine Chapel. And here Leonardo, master of so many disciplines, found no place he could freely claim as his own. Soon after his arrival, he was granted access to the papal court, a space that had welcomed figures such as Bramante and Michelangelo. Yet Leonardo felt little attraction to grand commissions. Rather than painting a triumphant religious scene, he filled his notebooks with observations of how light touched ancient walls, how rainwater revealed the grain of stone. He preferred wandering through Roman gardens, walking among broken columns, studying stone light shadow and the way air softened the edges of lines on Corinthian capitals. In the notebooks from this period, one finds a series of sketches that resist easy classification. Curves of weathered rock, the path of a beam of light slipping through a narrow opening, the lingering swirl of sound echoing between ancient columns. These were not plans for a specific monument. They were records of effects and behaviors of how force, light, air, and sound move through space. Rome stood as a vast archive of classical heritage, yet Leonardo quietly gathered the overlooked details. No major project reached completion during these years. No supreme fresco, no monument bearing his name. Leonardo knew how to move within the life of the city, but in Rome he found no arena for the deep inquiries that guided him. One autumn afternoon he climbed the steps near the Pantheon, where sunset light gradually spilled across travertine vaults, emphasizing the curve and deep shadow of each opening. Everything was vividly present before his eyes, yet none of it asked to be fixed into a finished image. These were phenomena unfolding, not forms to be frozen. Leonardo observed and recorded, but no one offered him an empty wall on which he might answer these questions in the way society expected. He devoted himself to the study of the human body with greater intensity than at any previous moment. Yet in Rome, these investigations were treated as marginal notes, drawings of muscles, ligaments, skeletal motion materials that would later become invaluable to science, did little to elevate his standing in the artistic world of the time. He continued to experiment. How light reflects off a rough wall, how water pooled on a stone floor trembles beneath each footstep, how the movement of a body shifts in relation to the space around it. To Rome, these were beautiful accidents, not outcomes meant to be carved into history. Rome did not exclude him. He was still respected. He was invited to banquets, consulted on minor architectural sketches, and displayed as proof that the city still hosted a great master. But no one quite knew how to place his intelligence within a project that would decisively shape the artistic legacy of the age. Not because Leonardo lacked talent, but because the way he saw the world did not align with Rome's measures of value. Public action, finished products, clear conclusions. In the notebooks he carried throughout the city, what stands out is not a grand plan, but a constellation of principles. Light radiating through a candle aperture. The way curved ventilation alters sound in a hall. How a falling leaf disrupts the swirl of water in a stone basin. These were his concerns. Ideas that later generations would unfold into physics, optics, and mechanics. Rome, then, was not a chapter of visible triumph, but of quiet inquiry. If Florence had thrown Leonardo out of rhythm through haste, Rome made him feel like an observer beside a machine already running on a different track. No failure, no open conflict, just a divergence of paths, Leonardo understood this, and as the last light of day spread across Rome's ancient stone, he quietly prepared for his next step, to continue his journey in his own way, toward a place where he could live fully within his own rhythm, where he could once again experiment, once again ask questions, and once again compel history to pause and listen to what intelligence might still say. Yet before leaving for France, Leonardo remained faithful to something he had carried from Florence through Milan and into Rome. A portrait not yet finished, one that stayed with him like a second self. And in that silence, the painting began to move beyond the boundary of an artwork, becoming a convergence point for every question he had pursued throughout his life. That painting was the Mona Lisa. Chapter 16. Mona Lisa. The painting that was never finished. A face. A smile that seems to appear and vanish at the same time. A gaze that does not follow you yet is always present. For the final 16 years of his life, Leonardo da Vinci carried this portrait with him from Florence to Milan, from Rome to France, as if it were not merely a work of art, but a part of himself. Later generations would call it the Mona Lisa. Yet Leonardo never named the painting in his notebooks. He wrote only of layers of pigment of light and facial angles of bone structure and how humidity altered color. For him, it was not a painting meant to be presented. It was a problem not yet solved. The work likely began around 1503, at the same time he was sketching ideas for the Battle of Anghiari. The woman portrayed Lisa Gherardini, wife of the merchant Francesco del Giocondo, had been commissioned as a subject. But Leonardo did not stop there. He kept the painting, never delivered it to the Giocondo family, and continued to revise it, rework it, and add to it year after year. Mona Lisa became an open field of observation. From the underlayers of paint to the contour of the lips, from the softened shadow at the corner of the eyes to the distant gray-blue background, everything was placed under the lens of a questioning mind. Leonardo wanted to know what makes an expression feel alive. Is it light? Is it proportion? Or is it the memory the viewer brings and projects into those eyes? He wrote about how light alters facial expression and how the mood of the observer transforms the experience of a painting. For Leonardo, life did not reside solely in brushstrokes. It lived in the moving relationship between image and viewer, where gaze, emotion, and time all participate in continuing the act of creation. To achieve this effect, Leonardo refined a technique he pursued with relentless care. Sfumato, meaning veiled or smoky, instead of drawing sharp boundaries between light and shadow, he allowed them to dissolve into one another like mist. Edges disappear. What remains is a slow-breathing sense of motion. Because of this, Mona Lisa's smile is never fixed. It changes with the light, with the angle of view, and even with the emotional state of the person who stands before her. Those eyes do not look straight ahead. They are slightly off-center, as if caught in thought. Yet wherever the viewer stands, the gaze seems to meet them, not through direct sight, but through presence. This instability is what turns the portrait into a threshold, a place where the viewer does not merely look, but feels looked back upon. Mona Lisa wears no jewelry. There is no gold background, no emblem of rank or authority as was customary in portraits of the time. She sits calmly before an unreal landscape. Jagged mountains, winding rivers, a road that appears and disappears. The setting feels less like geography than an inner terrain unfolding from her mind. She is not simply a specific woman. She becomes an image of consciousness itself, alive and in motion. In sketches and notes surrounding the painting, Leonardo da Vinci wrote extensively about blood flow, about how blood rises to the face when emotion shifts. He studied how light reveals the cheekbones, how skin appears translucent beneath thin layers of paint. For him, portraiture was not only visual, it was biology, psychology, and perception. Once he paused before an unfinished brushstroke at the corner of the mouth. He did not correct it, perhaps because he sensed that imperfection carries change, a smile about to emerge, or one that has just faded. That state of near completion is what gives the painting more life than any perfectly resolved portrait. For 16 years he carried the painting with him, revising it, then stepping back to observe. In Rome he accepted a few new painting commissions. He spent his time recording the behavior of light waves and refraction, then returned to apply a barely perceptible wash of yellow to Mona Lisa's eyelids, simply to see whether light could alter the viewer's sense of time. People have long wondered why he never declared the work finished. But for Leonardo, there is no final version of life. A work only stops when the artist no longer has questions. And he always had questions. When he traveled to France in 1516 at the invitation of Francis I, Leonardo da Vinci still carried the Mona Lisa with him, packed separately as if transporting an unanswered inquiry. At Château du Clos, Lucé, he hung the painting in his private room. At times he added a few strokes. At other times he simply sat before it in silence. His students later recalled days when he spoke not a word, spending the entire afternoon gazing at the portrait. Perhaps he understood that he could never truly finish the painting. And yet, it is precisely for that reason that Mona Lisa escaped the limits of time. It was not fixed to a moment of completion. It opened instead into a journey of gaze, of expression, of life itself. Today, the painting hangs behind bulletproof glass at the Louvre, watched by millions. But it is possible Leonardo never painted it for them. He painted it for himself. To understand, to question, to keep expanding his capacity to feel and perceive the world. And perhaps because he never closed this work, it continues to live. Not as a finished form, but as something fluid, always changing. It is not merely a portrait. It is a mirror of a mind in motion. Within that face, Leonardo found what he had pursued all his life. How an image might become more than an image. How it might become a living presence. And there, he did not need to finish. Because the endless act of questioning was the most complete form he could ever reach. Chapter 17. Leonardo da Vinci in France. Late Freedom. When Leonardo da Vinci left Rome, he carried with him a burden made heavier by countless notes, sketches, and questions without immediate answers. The journey to France was not an escape. It was a deliberate movement, a step toward a place where he hoped his intellect would be received at a different rhythm, less constrained by the molds and criteria of his age. France in the early 16th century was an emerging power increasingly infused with the Renaissance spirit from Italy. Under the reign of Francis I, art and scholarship were regarded as companions of power, and the king did not hesitate to recruit the greatest minds in Europe to enrich his libraries, schools, and palaces. To Francis I, Leonardo was not merely an artist. He embodied the spirit of intellectual openness, a mind reaching toward new horizons of understanding. When Leonardo arrived in France in 1516, he was 64 years old, no longer the young ambitious figure who had departed from Florence or Milan, but a man of deep experience tempered by decades of inquiry. At Château du Clos-Lucé, just a short walk from the royal residence at Amboise, he received lifelong patronage from Francis I, a rare combination of honor, security, and freedom that few artists of the time could imagine. France offered a different atmosphere from Rome or Florence. Here, unburdened by expectations of monumental frescoes or political symbols, Leonardo could return to what he valued most: freedom of thought, refined observation, and the continuous act of questioning. The setting of Clos-Lucé, with its broad gardens, winding paths, and still waters reflecting the sky, provided a quiet field of observation where he could continue the notes that had accompanied him for decades. Each morning he walked along the gravel paths leading from the chateau gates, where early light settled on damp grass, recording the subtle shifts of mist as dawn emerged. He observed how light filtered through thin clouds, how individual rays revealed the surface of leaves or made droplets on petals sparkle like small gems. Here, nature opened itself as a vast laboratory, no walls to paint, no demand for completion, only phenomena unfolding, changing, and overlapping. Francis I never compelled him to produce a specific work. Instead, the king often invited him to the table, asked what he had been observing lately, or strolled with him through the palace gardens, where conversation turned to light water and the sky. To Francis, Leonardo was a guide to thinking, not merely an artist. And it was precisely this recognition that granted Leonardo the intellectual space he had sought his entire life. In France, Leonardo did not return to his earlier projects. Instead, he continued to deepen the notes he had accumulated, light as continuous motion, water as an expression of time and the human body, as a system of operation more intricate than any machine he had ever designed. He reread his older manuscripts, carefully revised his writings on optics, and added new observations about the cooler atmosphere, the way light differed with the changing seasons, and how water behaved under varying temperatures. The French environment did not urge him to finish works. It invited him to continue a line of thought. And so, Leonardo spent his time extending chains of reasoning. He studied light passing through raindrops, caught on flowering branches, the concentric ripples spreading when a drop struck a still lake, and the way light refracted into bands of color within the morning mist. All of these were variations of motion, deeper layers of discourse on force and time, which he recorded with the same care he once used to describe how a wrist joint contracts under tension, or how a ray of light deforms across a stone surface. In France, he continued his anatomical studies, but no longer in service of portrait painting. He observed how the heartbeat pulsed beneath the skin, how layers of muscle contracted and relaxed at rest and in motion, how blood vessels caught the light when a hand was raised into the sun. These notes were not merely artistic sketches. They were evidence of a mind continually questioning itself about how the world works. In the notebooks from this period, one finds pages divided in two, half filled with scenes of nature, half layered with technical principles, optics, mechanics, and biology, overlapping one another. He regarded them all as facets of a larger system in which every movement, whether of light, water, or muscular contraction, followed laws he was still striving to decipher. Leonardo was no longer bound by the rhythm of any great city. Florence had once demanded images, Milan had required applied technique, Rome had expected visible results. But France granted him freedom. That freedom did not come from the absence of demands. It came from a place where perception and reflection were valued on equal footing with production, where understanding itself was the value, not merely a step towards something else. At nearly 70 years of age, he was no longer racing against time, but using time as a medium to probe intersections between light and shadow, between motion and stillness, between sensation and explanation. Students from many regions came to see him not to learn how to paint, but to learn how to observe. They recorded what he said and what he drew. But more important than either was the way he framed questions. In the final days of his life, he continued to write, not to complete a grand research program, but to keep inquiry open. One afternoon, while walking in the garden at Clos-Lucé, he stopped before a small pond where gentle ripples spread outward with each passing breeze. He did not add another note. He simply stood in silence, just as he had throughout his life, and allowed his mind to continue creating from that silence itself. Leonardo died in 1519, but the notes he left behind were not final answers. They were starting points for countless new inquiries. In France, where he found a belated freedom, Leonardo may not have completed any great project by traditional standards, but he completed what mattered most. He expanded the way the world could be seen. For him, freedom was not an ending, but a process, and that process, though closed by death, opened endlessly for those who would follow. Chapter 18. Leonardo da Vinci, the legacy of unclosed questions. When Leonardo da Vinci died in France in 1519, he left behind a body of material heavier than that of anyone of his age. Tens of thousands of pages of sketches, notes, models, and diagrams ranging across architecture, motion, anatomy, riverbeds, light, water, and even structures seemingly invisible such as psychology and sensation, were gathered into drawers, boxes, and rolls of aging parchment. But what makes his legacy unlike that of any other artist is not its quantity, but the quality of the questions he posed. Most Renaissance masters left behind completed works, monuments remembered by name, by scale, by ornate inscriptions. Leonardo, by contrast, did not bequeath finished monumental frescoes to great halls, nor cast triumphant statues for public squares. He left behind pages of questions far more than pages of answers. To later generations, this has made him enigmatic. Why would a mind so extraordinary never close a comprehensive research program? Why would an artist of such brilliance complete so few works? Perhaps the answer lies in how he viewed the world itself, not as something to be decoded once and for all, but as a continuous flow that must be listened to. A drop of water falling onto a still lake for others, a fleeting moment. For Leonardo, a phenomenon to be observed for a lifetime. How does water generate ripples? How does the light reflected on that trembling surface change with each step taken nearby? How does the human eye perceive such motion? One question led to another, and each question opened a new way of seeing. He did not draw in order to close things off, but to continue. His manuscripts on the human body did not culminate in a medical textbook. Yet they contain observations that science would only verify centuries later. His notes on waves on shadow on the way, light slants through a window on a winter afternoon were not meant to complete a theory, but to deepen the inquiry into motion and time. In France, the final place he lived, the quiet days at Clos were not devoted to laboring toward finished works. They were devoted to observing, reflecting, and adding further layers to the perceptual map he had been drawing all his life. There were afternoons when he simply sat beside a small pond, watching the wind pass over its mirrored surface, and wrote nothing at all. Yet who can know whether in that silence he was not conversing with the world more profoundly than in any manuscript? Leonardo's legacy, then, is not a closed system of knowledge, but an open horizon. He left behind not conclusions, but invitations to look again, to look longer, and to understand that the deepest form of knowing may lie not in answers, but in the courage to keep questions alive. Leonardo's legacy, therefore, does not lie in monumental works or closed systems of doctrine. It lies in the way he looked, the way he asked, and the way he refused to confine the world to a single answer. His intellect left no final testament, only windows. Through those windows, generations have since stepped forward, carrying with them new fields: mechanics, optics, medicine, multi-dimensional art. He lived as the most patient of observers, and he departed as someone who was still observing. For Leonardo, inquiry was the only way to exist. And because of him, the world is not only seen more clearly, it has learned that seeing is never enough. We must look again, look deeper, and look through questions. Only someone who spent a lifetime asking could leave behind questions no one had yet imagined. Night settles over an old map. The inked lines have faded. The rivers are now thin gray traces. The mountain ranges, once drawn by a human hand, lie still like folds in time. A lamp hangs high above its light, not meant to illuminate clearly, but only to remind us that this map was once unfolded, once laid before a person trying to understand the world. There is no movement. Only a quiet space where history has paused for a very long time. At the edge of the map, a narrow road runs toward the hills of Tuscany. That road once appeared in morning mist, when the earth was still damp and footsteps carried no purpose. Now it returns under a weaker light, no longer a beginning, but a thin thread linking what has already happened with what continues to unfold. Light no longer opens the world. It merely preserves the outline of what was once seen. The world may change, but the way humans look at it never stands still. Outside the room, the wind moves across other lands, through cities lit by cold, white electric lights, through laboratories where artificial illumination reflects off metal and glass, through glowing screens that stay awake all night, where image for images, data, and drawings continue to layer upon one another. The systems born later science technology design still operate on an old habit: observe, test, and look once more. No one draws maps of the world by hand anymore, yet the world is still divided, measured, and remade each day. No one writes backward on paper yet. Questions remain tucked into hidden corners of thought. The relationships between image and law, between nature and humanity, have never vanished. They have only changed the language. The night continues to pass. The wind gently lifts the edge of the map. The paper trembles like a small ripple on still water. Far away, it might be the sound of flowing water, or perhaps only space shifting itself. The lamp dims, not extinguished, merely retreating, yielding to familiar darkness. If you wish to remain in this slow rhythm of storytelling, stay with the channel or share it with someone else who is also seeking a moment of quiet. The wind still blows, and somewhere beneath the layers of closed time history continues to breathe silently.